All right, so Luciano's Mystic Dream. So this is one of the newest sort of Louis Vuitton interpretations that have been put out there. And this was the last one that I actually picked up. I did an impressions video, like a first impressions video of this fragrance, and it smelled really good in my opinion. And in my opinion, it still does. But in this video, I'm just going to be giving my final thoughts and whether or not I would recommend this fragrance over, some of the other alternatives that you can get for, Louis Vuitton's Imagination. So overall, I do think that this is a very, very solid, interpretation of Imagination. Obviously, the price difference is going to be, it's almost about 10 times the difference. So I believe I picked this one up for like the mid 30s or so on either Fragflex or Fragrance Buy. I can't remember which site. Whereas obviously with this one, this is going to be 320. So there is a huge difference in terms of the price. And there is definitely a difference in quality for sure. There's a difference in performance with this one as well. But is it 10 times better? I can't necessarily say that. So, I think if you're somebody who's on a budget and, a $320 fragrance is just completely out of the question, then, stuff like this is still going to be, a pretty viable option for you. Now, the main differences that I get between the Mystic Dream and Imagination are, it does start in the opening. So in the opening with Imagination, you're going to get that really tart, but, yet bright and crisp, citron note. All right. That's what you're going to get in the initial opening blast of this fragrance. Whereas in my opinion, with the Luciano Mystic Dream, it smells more of sort of like a cheaper lemon sort of note. Rather than that really crisp, sort of citron note that you get with Imagination. Now, I don't know if Louis Vuitton has some sort of, proprietary, patent or something like that on that citron note. Because I noticed, I really only kind of see that citron note, at least here recently, with a lot of Louis Vuitton fragrances. I'm sure there's probably some other fragrances that use that note, but at least to my knowledge, Louis Vuitton fragrances are really the only fragrances that kind of, use that note, especially as often as what they're used in the Louis Vuitton fragrances. So again, like I said, I definitely can tell the difference between that sort of citron note that you get in this and, the sort of citrus notes that you're getting in something like this. And they don't smell, as up to par as what they do in the Louis Vuitton. Now, with that being said, I will still say that this fragrance, it does smell very close to the Louis Vuitton, at least in that initial opening. When you first spray the two on, at least for probably the first 5 to 10 minutes, in my opinion, this smells very close to Imagination. It smells like probably 90 to 95% close, at least in my opinion, when you first spray it on. Now, that does start to kind of fade off as the fragrance starts to dry down. And in my opinion, it's because there's, again, in my opinion, like a different sort of citrus note that's being emphasized. Now, the Louis Vuitton, I believe, does have mandarin in the top notes. I believe the top notes are like citron, bergamot, and mandarin. To me, I'm getting way more mandarin orange. Like that, in my opinion, is what is like the main thing that you smell in the Mystic Dream is the mandarin orange. So you don't really get much of, sort of like that citron note, which adds, the sort of tartness and the really sort of bright, crisp opening. You really don't have that in the Luciano after like the first few minutes. And it does also, it is coming off as a sweeter fragrance in my opinion, than what the Louis Vuitton does. The Louis Vuitton, just in terms of like the way that the notes are blended and balanced, there's really nothing that, completely does it exactly like the Louis Vuitton does. Obviously, Alexandria's Visionary, it comes close, I would say. Same thing, I would say with the what is it, the Zoha Aroma Lagoon Soiree. That one is also pretty good as well. It has a really, really natural smell to it. In my opinion, the way that the Zoha Aroma comes across in terms of quality anyway is also pretty on par with the Louis Vuitton, at least in my opinion anyway. That one, I think, has the best quality, in terms of any sort of inspiration of, imagination that I've smelled. But yeah, when it comes to the Mystic Dream versus the Imagination, the Mystic Dream just doesn't necessarily cut it in terms of like the quality. Now, again, the differences, I mean, they are pretty noticeable, especially when you smell the two side by side. But I still think, especially if you're somebody who has never really even smelled the original Imagination, and maybe you've just smelled, like other sort of interpretations of Imagination. But like, let's say maybe for instance, you've only smelled something like Intimation, by Emperor, or, now they brand it under Milestone. This is going to smell significantly better, in my opinion anyway, than Intimation will. All right. Just in terms of like the overall quality, the overall smell is better. But at the same time, this will not be better, in my opinion, than something like Alexandria's Visionary, the Lagoon Soiree from Zoha Aroma. And I would even say that Essence de Blanc, in my opinion anyway, it does have a higher quality smell than what this does. Because it definitely doesn't come off again as sweet as what this, Mystic Dream does. So to me, what they kind of did with Mystic Dream, in my opinion, was they sort of put a twist on this fragrance. I don't know if that was like intentional or if it was just because, obviously they don't have access to like the same materials as Louis Vuitton has. But, again, from what I'm smelling from the Mystic Dream, it is going to be sweeter, and it's going to have a heavier emphasis on mandarin orange. As far as the neroli note goes in the Mystic Dream, it is barely noticeable. And what's kind of weird about this fragrance is, even though I'm really not smelling too much like actual neroli from this fragrance, it does still have like a really sort of soapy feel to the fragrance. So like when you smell it up close, it smells pretty soapy. It kind of smells like almost kind of like an orange sort of soap or shower gel, sort of. Like maybe a orange and other sort of citrus, kind of shower gel or soap. That's the way that it comes across. In my opinion, I'm not really getting much of, like that, sort of spiced, tea and citrus combination that you get from Imagination, which comes from the neroli, the black tea, the ginger, the Ceylon cinnamon. I'm not really getting that same exact feel from, Mystic Dream. This is coming off as being a slightly more denser fragrance. It doesn't come off as watery as Imagination does. Obviously, it's not going to be as well blended. And just overall, it is, in my opinion, kind of more of like its own thing for the most part. All right. So in terms of the performance on this fragrance, the performance is about average for the most part. So I never really got more than about 6.5 to about 7 hours or so of total longevity out of this fragrance. Whereas, with some of the other sort of, Louis Vuitton Imagination inspirations, I've definitely been able to get, more than that. Definitely with Visionary, I know I got more than that. Essence de Blanc, I believe, was the one that gave me the most longevity. That one I definitely got over 10 hours or so, 10 to 12 hours. So that one was definitely the best performing one that I got. Chorus Blue Spice, I believe, was like around probably 8 or 9 hours or so. Definitely it was more than this was. And then, you have, inspirations that are more on the lower end, when it comes to performance, like Intimation. That one, like I mentioned, when I, first did my review on that one, that fragrance would only last, I think, like around 4 to 5 hours or so. So I think Intimation for me was like the least performing, imagination inspiration. This one is just kind of like right there in the middle. It's not like terrible, but it's not going to be the most beast mode when it comes to, like the overall longevity. Now, when it comes to the projection, though, the projection on this Mystic Dream is actually pretty good. So I actually get better projection out of the Mystic Dream than what I do with the Imagination. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that, like I said, this one is not going to be as watery as what Imagination is. And just overall, the smell of the fragrance is going to be a little bit more sweeter. So it's going to come off as slightly more thicker than what the Imagination will. So that's, I think, why I'm getting, better projection out of this fragrance. And I mean, it gives you pretty decent projection, at least for, I would say about the first 2 hours is what I'm getting, in terms of projection with this fragrance. So really, really good on this one for sure. But, after that, it does definitely die down. And like I said, it only lasts for me about 6.5 to 7 hours or so. So for a freshie, that is pretty solid. That'll, for the most part, kind of get you, almost through a work day for the most part. You can, obviously keep a decant on you and just kind of spray halfway through the day, and that'll definitely get you through the rest of the shift. But overall, this is, I would say a decent performer. All right. Now, if I'm going to give this fragrance a sort of closeness rating on a scale from 1 to 100 when comparing it to Imagination, this, in my opinion, is going to be about 80%. Yeah, I would say about 80% close to Imagination overall. It's definitely, it's not going to be the absolute closest to Imagination, but it's not going to be like the worst one that I've smelled. Not at all. Now, when it comes to just an overall rating, in terms of how I like this fragrance just on its own, in my opinion, this fragrance is a solid like 7.5 out of 10. So, it's not, again, the worst fragrance. It's not the worst interpretation, that I've come across of Imagination. And obviously it's not going to be the best, but, in terms of price, and, just overall value, this is a very good scent. This is going to be much better than the, Paris Corner interpretation, in my opinion, just in terms of how close it comes to the original fragrance. This is actually going to get you closer than that fragrance will. Like I've mentioned before in my, review of the Paris Corner, I believe it's Trois. That fragrance to me just really doesn't smell like Imagination at all, in my opinion anyway. There's parts of the fragrance that you can definitely tell are inspired by Imagination, but just overall as a scent, in my opinion, it's not really even close to Imagination at all. Whereas, again, this one in the initial opening, super close. And then as it starts to dry down, it starts to kind of go in its own sort of direction. All right. So overall, man, I do still recommend this, especially if you're someone who is really budget conscious. And maybe let's say you have all of the other Lucianno, Louis Vuitton, inspirations, and you just want to add this to your collection. I would say definitely go ahead and do it. It's not going to be as close as what some of those other Lucianos are to the original Louis Vuitton fragrances, but this is still a pretty solid choice in my opinion. All right. So that's my take on Luciano's Mystic Dream. Let me know what you all think about this fragrance in the comments. And also, if you're brand new to the channel, do me a favor, go ahead and subscribe. And again, that's Jamar from Vegas Scents. I'll see you on the next video.